In the harsh Wyoming Territory of 1867, widowed rancher Jacob Hartwell hired a mysterious woman to restore his late wife's garden, never expecting her gentle hands would also tend to his buried heart. But when federal marshals arrive with murder charges and dark secrets from her past threaten to destroy their growing bond, will love prove strong enough to bloom in even the most unforgiving soil? Jacob Hartwell's boots hit the ground with a thud that echoed across the empty prairie like a gunshot. The Wyoming wind whipped around him as he stared at what used to be his wife's pride and joy. Where beautiful flowers once danced in the breeze, only brown weeds and cracked dirt remained. Catherine would cry if she could see this mess, he whispered to his horse, Thunder. The big brown animal snorted and shook his head, as if he understood every word. Jacob pulled his hat down tight against the dusty wind that seemed to blow constantly across the Broken Arrow Ranch. The year was 1867, and life in the Wyoming Territory was harder than old leather. Most folks worked cattle or tried their luck at mining. But Catherine had been different. She believed this wild land could grow something beautiful. She spent every morning in her garden, singing soft songs while she watered her plants and pulled weeds. Now she was gone, buried up on the hill behind the house where the wind couldn't reach her anymore. And her garden looked like a graveyard too. Jacob walked through the rusty gate that hung crooked on broken hinges. Every step made him remember. Here was where Catherine grew her tomatoes, red as summer sunsets. There was the spot where she planted herbs that made their simple meals taste like fancy restaurant food. And over by the fence stood the skeleton of what used to be her rose bush, the one she called her little miracle. Stupid roses don't belong in Wyoming anyway, Jacob muttered, but his voice cracked like a teenage boy's. He kicked at a clump of dead grass and watched it blow away in the wind. The truth was, Jacob missed more than just the garden. He missed the sound of Catherine humming while she worked. He missed the way she'd come in at sunset with dirt under her fingernails and flowers in her hair. He missed having someone who believed that ugly places could become beautiful with enough love and work. But believing was for fools, and Jacob Hartwell was nobody's fool. At least, that's what he told himself as he stood in the ruins of his wife's dreams. Thunder nickered softly behind him, and Jacob turned to see dust rising on the horizon. A rider was coming fast, which usually meant trouble in these parts. Jacob's hand moved to the gun on his hip, but as the horse got closer, he saw it was just young Billy Crawford from town. "Mr. Hartwell," Billy called out, waving a piece of paper in the air. "Got a letter for you." Came on the morning stage. Jacob frowned. Nobody ever sent him letters. Most folks around here couldn't read or write much anyway. Billy slid off his sweaty horse and handed over the envelope. The paper was fancy, cream-colored and smooth. Jacob's name was written across the front in handwriting so neat it looked like art. "Who's it from?" Billy asked, his eyes bright with curiosity. "Don't know yet." Jacob tore open the envelope carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in the same beautiful writing. As he read, his eyebrows climbed toward his hairline like two caterpillars racing. The letter was about his advertisement. 3 weeks ago, in a moment of weakness, Jacob had posted a notice in the Laramie newspaper. Wanted, gardener to restore ranch garden. Must know plants. Hard work. Good pay. He'd figured nobody would answer. Who would want to come all the way out to the middle of nowhere to dig in the dirt? But someone had answered. Someone who signed their name R. Adelaide, and wrote things like, "I understand the language of growing things," and "I believe every piece of earth holds the promise of beauty." Well, Billy bounced on his toes like a rabbit. "What's it say?" Jacob folded the letter and slipped it into his vest pocket. "Seems I might be getting some help with the garden after all." Billy's mouth fell open. "Really? Someone wants to come work way out here? Are they crazy?" Jacob looked back at the broken garden, then at the letter bulging in his pocket. Maybe they were crazy. Maybe he was crazy for even thinking about it. But something about those words, "Every piece of earth holds the promise of beauty," made his chest feel tight in a way he hadn't felt since Catherine died. "Maybe," he said finally, "but crazy might be exactly what this place needs." As Billy rode away with his gossip, Jacob read the letter again. Our Adelaide would arrive on next Tuesday's stage, if the position was still available. The letter didn't say if our Adelaide was a man or woman, young or old. It just talked about plants and soil and bringing life to empty places. Jacob walked back through the garden one more time, seeing it through different eyes. What if those words were true? What if this dead ground really could grow something beautiful again? What if Catherine had been right all along, and he'd just been too scared to try? The sun was setting now, painting the sky the color of Catherine's favorite roses. Jacob made his decision. Tomorrow he'd ride to town and send a telegram. Our Adelaide could come. The position was definitely still available. The Laramie General Store buzzed like a hive of angry bees on Tuesday morning. Jacob pushed through the crowd of curious townspeople, all pretending to shop while really waiting to see who would step off the stage. News traveled faster than wildfire in small towns, and everyone knew Jacob Hartwell had hired himself a gardener. 50 cents says it's some old prospector who gave up on gold, whispered Pete Martinez, the blacksmith. My money's on a traveling preacher, added Mrs. Henderson, clutching her shopping basket tight. Only preachers talk fancy about dirt and growing things. Jacob ignored the chatter and positioned himself near the store's front window. His stomach felt like it was full of jumping grasshoppers. What if this are? Adelaide took one look at the harsh Wyoming landscape and decided to catch the next stage back east. What if they expected a real garden instead of a patch of weeds and broken dreams? The stagecoach horns sounded in the distance, long and low like a wolf's howl. Conversations stopped. Even the babies seemed to hold their breath. Jacob straightened his shoulders and checked his reflection in the window glass. His dark hair was combed neat, his face was clean-shaved, and his best shirt was pressed and tucked. Catherine always said first impressions mattered. Mayor Webb stepped up beside him, puffing on his pipe like a fat toad. You sure about this, Jacob? Hiring some stranger sight unseen? Could be anyone getting off that stage. Could be, Jacob agreed, but his jaw was set firm. Guess we'll find out soon enough. The stagecoach rounded the corner in a cloud of dust and jingling harnesses. 6 tired horses pulled the big wooden box that carried mail, packages, and passengers between towns. Driver Sam Murphy sat high on the seat, his weathered face split by a grin that showed 3 missing teeth. Afternoon, folks, Sam called out, pulling the horses to a stop. Got mail, supplies, and 1 passenger today. The crowd pressed closer as Sam climbed down and opened the passenger door. A man's boot appeared first, then a leg in dark pants. Jacob's heart sank. So our Adelaide was a man after all. Probably some drifter looking for easy work and free meals. But then the rest of the passengers stepped down, and Jacob's world tilted sideways like a house in an earthquake. Our Adelaide was definitely not a man. She was a woman, probably around 25, with reddish-brown hair pinned up neat under a simple blue bonnet. Her traveling dress was practical but well-made, the kind that said she had some money but wasn't fancy about it. She moved with quiet confidence, like she belonged wherever she happened to be standing. But it was her eyes that made Jacob's breath catch in his throat. They were green as spring grass, and they looked at the rough frontier town without fear or judgment. When those eyes found his across the crowd, she smiled slightly and walked straight toward him. Mr. Hartwell? Her voice was soft but clear, with just a hint of an accent he couldn't place. I'm Rose Adelaide. I believe you're expecting me. The crowd went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the dusty street. Jacob felt heat creep up his neck as every eye in town focused on him. Hiring a woman to work his land? What would people think? What would they say? But then Rose Adelaide held out her hand for a proper handshake, just like a man would do, and Jacob found himself taking it without thinking. Her grip was firm and her palm was slightly rough, like she wasn't afraid of hard work. Miss Adelaide, he managed to say. Welcome to Laramie. Thank you. She glanced around at the staring crowd with amusement dancing in her green eyes. I hope I'm not causing a disturbance. Small towns do love their excitement. Mayor Webb cleared his throat loudly. Miss Adelaide, isn't it? Might I ask where you're from? We like to know our visitors here in Laramie. Rose's smile never wavered, but Jacob caught something flicker across her face. Fear? Sadness? It was gone so fast he might have imagined it. I've been traveling for some time, Mayor. Most recently from Kansas. She turned back to Jacob. Perhaps we could discuss the position somewhere more private? I'm eager to see what challenges await. Jacob nodded quickly, grateful for an excuse to escape the crowd's hungry stares. My horse and wagon are just down the street. I can show you the ranch, and you can decide if it's what you expected. As they walked toward his wagon, Jacob heard the whispers start behind them like leaves rustling in the wind. A woman gardener, working alone with Jacob Hartwell. What was the world coming to? Rose seemed to hear the whispers too, but she kept her chin up and her steps steady. She climbed into the wagon seat beside Jacob without waiting for help, settling her small traveling bag at her feet. They seem very interested in your business, she observed as Jacob clicked to the horses. Small town, Jacob said, feeling the need to apologize. Folks don't see many strangers, especially women traveling alone and looking for work? Rose finished with a slight smile. I'm used to curious stares, Mr. Hartwell. People always wonder about a woman on her own. As they rode out of town toward the Broken Arrow Ranch, Jacob found himself stealing glances at his passenger. She sat straight but relaxed, taking in the landscape with those sharp green eyes. When they passed a meadow full of wildflowers, she actually leaned forward with interest. Beautiful country, she said. Harsh but beautiful. The soil must be rich under all that grass. My wife thought so. The words slipped out before Jacob could stop them. She had big plans for the garden. Rose turned to look at him directly. She died last winter. Fever took her. Jacob kept his eyes on the road ahead. The garden died with her, I'm afraid. Haven't had the heart to tend it proper. I'm sorry for your loss. Rose's voice was gentle, full of understanding. Losing someone who sees beauty in the world, that's a special kind of grief. Jacob nodded, surprised by how much her words meant to him. Most people just said they were sorry and changed the subject quick. But Rose Adelaide seemed to understand that some losses cut deeper than others. They rode in comfortable silence until the ranch buildings came into view. Jacob watched Rose's face as she took in the main house, the barn, the corrals where his cattle gathered. But her eyes went straight to the garden plot beside the house, and she leaned forward with real interest. There, she said, pointing. That's where the magic happened. Magic. Jacob almost snorted. If that tangle of weeds and broken trellises was magic, it was the dark kind. But as Rose climbed down from the wagon and walked toward the garden gate, Jacob found himself seeing it through her eyes. The bones of Catherine's design were still there, buried under neglect. The paths between beds, the spots where arbors once stood, the careful placement that made the most of sun and shade. Rose knelt beside the gate and crumbled a handful of soil between her fingers. She brought it close to her nose and actually smelled it like some people might smell flowers. This earth remembers, she said, looking up at Jacob with excitement bright in her eyes. Someone loved this place deeply. The soil has been fed with compost and care over many seasons. It's not dead, Mr. Hartwell. It's just sleeping. Jacob felt his heart do something strange in his chest. Hope, maybe, or fear, or both mixed together until he couldn't tell which was which. Rose stood and brushed the dirt from her hands. If you'll have me, I'd like to wake it up. Rose's hands moved through the dirt like she was reading a book written in soil and roots. Jacob watched from the porch steps, his coffee growing cold in his cup as the morning sun climbed higher over the Wyoming hills. She'd been working for 3 days now, and every sunrise brought new surprises. Found something, Rose called out, her voice bright with discovery. She held up a tangled mess of what looked like dead sticks. Your wife's climbing roses. The roots are still alive underground. Jacob set down his coffee and walked closer. The thorny branches looked deader than last year's Christmas tree, but Rose cradled them like they were made of gold. Her face was streaked with dirt. Her sleeves rolled up past her elbows, and her hair had escaped its pins to curl around her face in the morning heat. You sure about that? Jacob asked. Looks pretty dead to me. Rose smiled and scraped away bark with her thumbnail. Underneath, the wood showed a thin line of green. Plants are tougher than people think. They survive winters that would kill a strong man. They bend in storms that would snap oak trees. Sometimes they just need someone to believe in them again. Something in her voice made Jacob look at her more carefully. She wasn't just talking about roses, he realized. But before he could ask what she meant, Rose was already moving on to the next bed, pointing out treasures hidden in the weeds. Mint here, still trying to take over the world like mint always does. And these little green shoots? Wild onions. Your wife must have planted them years ago, and they keep coming back every spring like faithful friends. Jacob found himself following her around the garden, listening to her explain which plants could be saved and which needed to be replanted. She talked about soil like other people talked about family members, with love and understanding and endless patience. But it wasn't just her knowledge that impressed him. It was the way she worked. Rose didn't just pull weeds and plant seeds. She touched everything gently, like she was introducing herself to each plant personally. When she found a bird's nest in the old apple tree, she worked around it carefully so the babies wouldn't be disturbed. You talk to them? Jacob observed, watching her whisper something to a struggling tomato plant as she tied it to a stake. Rose's cheeks turned pink. Old habit. My grandmother taught me that plants grow better when they know someone cares about them. Probably sounds foolish to you. No, Jacob said quietly. Catherine used to sing to hers. Said it helped them grow strong. The mention of his wife should have made him sad. But somehow it didn't. Instead, it felt like Catherine was still part of the garden, still helping things grow in her own way. Over the next few days, Jacob found excuses to stay near the garden. He fixed the fence that didn't really need fixing. He moved rocks that were perfectly fine where they were. He even started bringing Rose cool water and fresh coffee, telling himself it was just good manners. But the truth was harder to swallow. Jacob was starting to look forward to Rose's laugh when she discovered something new. He liked the way she pushed her hair back with muddy hands, leaving streaks of dirt across her forehead. He enjoyed their conversations about everything from the best way to keep rabbits out of the lettuce to whether it would rain before Sunday. Most of all, he was amazed by how the garden was changing. Where chaos had ruled for months, neat rows were appearing. The broken trellises had been rebuilt stronger than before. Even the weeds seemed to be retreating, as if they knew their time was up. It's like magic, he said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching fireflies dance over the garden in the twilight. Rose smiled and stretched her tired back. Not magic, just work and hope mixed together. Though I suppose that might be the same thing. Jacob wanted to ask her more about her life before Wyoming, about the sadness he sometimes saw in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. But Rose was a private person, and he respected that. Everyone had things they didn't want to talk about. Instead, he found himself sharing stories about Catherine, about their early days on the ranch, about the dreams they'd had for making the Broken Arrow a real home. Rose listened without judging, asking questions that showed she really cared about the answers. She sounds like she was a special woman, Rose said after Jacob told her about Catherine's plan to plant fruit trees all along the eastern fence. She was, Jacob agreed, used to say that making beautiful things was the closest humans could get to being like God, creating life instead of just surviving it. Rose was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the garden where her work was slowly bringing order to chaos. I think she was right, she said finally, and I think she'd be proud of what we're doing here. The word "we" hit Jacob like a gentle punch to the chest. When had this become we? When had Rose Adelaide stopped being the hired help and started being, what? Partner? A friend? Something more? The thought scared him more than he wanted to admit. Caring about someone meant risking loss again, and Jacob wasn't sure his heart could handle being broken twice. But as he watched Rose point out constellations in the darkening sky, her face peaceful and happy, Jacob realized it might already be too late to protect himself. Rose Adelaide was taking root in his life just like her plants were taking root in Catherine's garden. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a terrible thing. Sheriff Duncan Mackenzie's horse kicked up dust clouds that looked like smoke signals as he rode hard toward the Broken Arrow Ranch. Jacob saw him coming from a mile away and felt his stomach drop like a stone down a well. In his experience, lawmen riding fast usually brought bad news. "Jacob!" Mackenzie called out before his horse had even stopped moving. "We need to talk. Now." Rose looked up from where she was planting bean seeds, her hands still covered in rich, dark soil. Something in the sheriff's voice made her go very still, like a deer that senses danger but isn't sure which way to run. Jacob walked toward Mackenzie slowly, giving himself time to think. The sheriff was a good man, fair and honest, but he had a job to do. And right now, his job was making his face look like thunderclouds before a storm. "What's the problem, Duncan?" Jacob asked, though he was starting to guess what the answer might be. Mackenzie climbed down from his horse and glanced toward Rose, who was pretending to focus on her planting but was clearly listening to every word. "Maybe we should talk inside. Private-like. Anything you need to say to me can be said in front of Miss Adelaide," Jacob replied, crossing his arms over his chest. "She's part of this ranch now." The sheriff's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "That's exactly what I came to warn you about, Jacob. You might want to reconsider that position." Rose stood up slowly, brushing dirt from her hands with movements that were too careful, too controlled. Jacob had seen soldiers look that way right before a battle, calm on the outside, but ready for anything. "Sheriff," Rose said politely, "if there's something you need to know about me, perhaps you should ask me directly instead of talking around me like I'm not here." Mackenzie's face softened slightly. "Miss Adelaide, I'm not trying to be rude, but I've got some questions that came from pretty far away, and the answers might affect more than just you." "What kind of questions?" Jacob demanded, stepping closer to Rose without really thinking about it. "The kind that involve federal marshals and wanted posters," Mackenzie said grimly. "The kind that mention a dead husband in Kansas and a woman who disappeared the same night he died." The words hit the air like bullets. Rose went pale but didn't back down. Instead, she lifted her chin and looked Mackenzie straight in the eye. "I see my reputation has followed me west," she said calmly. "I suppose I should have expected that." Jacob felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. "Rose." She turned to face him, and he saw pain in her green eyes that cut deeper than any knife. "I didn't lie to you, Jacob. I just didn't tell you everything." "Didn't tell me what, exactly?" Jacob's voice came out rougher than he intended. Before Rose could answer, Mackenzie stepped between them. "Jacob, I need you to think about what you're doing here. This woman is wanted for questioning in a man's death. Federal marshals are already on their way. When they get here, you don't want to be seen as someone who helped hide a criminal." "I'm not hiding," Rose said firmly. "I never ran from the law. I just left a bad situation before it got worse." "Tell that to the marshals," Mackenzie replied. "They'll be here within the week, maybe sooner. My advice? Send her on her way before they arrive. Save yourself a lot of trouble." Jacob looked back and forth between the sheriff and Rose, his mind spinning like a dust devil. Part of him wanted to demand the whole truth right now. Another part wanted to tell Mackenzie to mind his own business and get off Broken Arrow land. But the biggest part, the part that surprised him most, wanted to protect Rose from whatever was coming. Even not knowing the full story, he could see the fear she was trying to hide. And he'd learned to read people pretty well over the years. Rose Adelaide might have secrets, but she wasn't a killer. "Duncan," Jacob said slowly, "I appreciate the warning, but Miss Adelaide is my employee, working on my land. Until someone proves she's done something wrong, she stays." Mackenzie shook his head. "Jacob, you're making a mistake. Think about your reputation in town. Think about your business. Is protecting some woman you barely know worth risking everything you've built?" "Some woman?" Jacob's voice rose. "Sheriff, that some woman has worked harder in the past week than most men do in a month. She's bringing life back to ground that was dying. And she's done it all without asking for anything except honest work and fair pay." Rose touched his arm gently. "Jacob, maybe the sheriff is right. Maybe I should go before I cause you more trouble." "No." The word came out harder than Jacob intended. You're not going anywhere. We have work to finish. Mackenzie mounted his horse with a frustrated sigh. You're both adults and it's your choice. But Jacob, when those marshals show up with questions, don't say I didn't warn you. As the sheriff rode away, Jacob and Rose stood in the garden watching until he disappeared over the hill. The silence between them felt heavy as storm clouds. I suppose you want to know about Kansas, Rose said finally. Only if you want to tell me, Jacob replied. But Rose, if you're in real trouble, if you need help, I want you to know you can trust me. Rose looked at him for a long moment, studying his face like she was trying to memorize it. William Adelaide was my husband. He died on a cold night in March, choking on his own vomit after a drinking bout. I found him on the kitchen floor and I left him there. Jacob waited for her to continue, but she seemed to be done talking. That's it. That's enough, isn't it? Rose's voice was bitter. A good wife would have tried to save him. A good wife wouldn't have packed her bags and left town before sunrise. A good wife certainly wouldn't have felt relief when she realized he couldn't hurt her anymore. The last words came out in a rush, like water bursting through a dam. Jacob saw tears in Rose's eyes, but her voice stayed steady. Rose, he said gently, what did he do to you? She turned away, looking out over the garden where her careful work was creating something beautiful from something broken. That's not important now. What matters is that when the marshals get here, they're going to ask hard questions. And you're going to have to choose between protecting a woman with a questionable past and protecting yourself. Jacob stepped closer, close enough to smell the lavender soap she used, and see the way the afternoon sun brought out gold highlights in her hair. Rose Adelaide, he said firmly, I already made my choice. You're staying. She looked up at him then, hope and fear warring in her green eyes. Even if it means trouble? Especially if it means trouble, Jacob replied. Seems to me you've had enough people in your life who let you down when things got difficult. I don't plan to be one of them. For the first time since Mackenzie had ridden up with his warnings, Rose smiled. It was small and fragile, but it was real. Thank you, she whispered. Jacob nodded and turned back toward the house, his mind already working on what needed to be done before the marshals arrived. He had a feeling the next few days were going to test everything he thought he knew about justice, loyalty, and the difference between what was legal and what was right. But looking back at Rose, who was already kneeling in the dirt again, tending to plants that would grow strong and beautiful under her care, Jacob knew he'd made the right choice. Some things were worth fighting for, and Rose Adelaide was definitely one of them. Rose's hands trembled as she poured coffee into Jacob's cup, the liquid sloshing dangerously close to the rim. Outside, thunder rolled across the Wyoming sky like God moving furniture in heaven. She'd been jumpy all morning, starting at every sound, watching the horizon like she expected devils to come riding out of the storm clouds. They'll be here today, she said quietly, setting the coffee pot back on the stove with a clatter. I can feel it in my bones. Jacob looked up from the legal papers spread across his kitchen table. Maybe, maybe not. Weather like this might keep them holed up in town for another day or two. But even as he spoke, they both heard it, the sound of horses' hooves on wet ground, coming fast despite the rain. Rose went to the window and peered through the curtains, her face going white as fresh snow. 3 riders, she whispered, one of them's wearing a badge that catches the lightning. Jacob stood and walked to her side. Through the rain-streaked glass, he could see the men dismounting near his front porch. The leader was tall and lean, with the kind of face that never smiled and eyes that missed nothing. His badge read U.S. Marshal, in letters that seemed to glow in the dim light. Marshal Henry Caldwell, the man announced when Jacob opened the door. This is Deputy Marshal James Creek and Deputy Thomas Ward. We're looking for a woman named Rose Adelaide. Jacob stepped onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind him. The rain drummed on the roof like bullets, and lightning split the sky in jagged white lines. What's this about, Marshal? Murder investigation, Caldwell replied flatly. We have reason to believe Miss Adelaide can help us understand what happened to her husband, William Adelaide, in Topeka, Kansas, Last March. Murder. Jacob's voice stayed steady, but his heart was pounding like a war drum. That's a serious accusation. Yes, it is. Caldwell's eyes were cold as Winter Creek water. Where is she, Mr. Hartwell? Before Jacob could answer, the door opened behind him. Rose stepped onto the porch, her chin held high despite the fear Jacob could see in her eyes. She'd changed into her best dress, the blue one with tiny flowers, and her hair was pinned up neat and proper. "I'm Rose Adelaide," she said clearly. "I believe you gentlemen want to speak with me." Deputy Creek, a younger man with nervous hands, stepped forward with metal handcuffs jangling. "Rose Adelaide, you're under arrest for the murder of William Adelaide." "Wait," Jacob said, moving between Rose and the deputy. "You can't just ride onto my property and arrest my employee without proof of wrongdoing." Marshal Caldwell's hand moved to rest on his gun. "Step aside, Mr. Hartwell. This is federal business." Rose placed a gentle hand on Jacob's arm. "It's all right, Jacob. I knew this day would come eventually." She looked directly at Marshal Caldwell. "I'll come with you willingly, but I want to make something clear. I didn't murder my husband." "That's for a judge and jury to decide," Caldwell replied. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you in court." As Deputy Creek moved to put the handcuffs on Rose, Jacob felt something break inside his chest. This was wrong. Rose was no killer. She was gentle with everything she touched, from tiny seedlings to hurt animals. The idea of her harming another human being was like saying the sun was cold or water flowed uphill. "Where are you taking her?" Jacob demanded. "Cheyenne, for trial," Caldwell answered. "Federal courthouse there can handle a case like this." Rose turned to Jacob, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. "Take care of the garden, Jacob. The fall plantings will need water every other day until the first frost. And the roses, they're stronger than they look. Don't give up on them." Jacob wanted to say something, anything that would make this better, but words seemed to stick in his throat like cotton. Instead, he watched helplessly as the marshals helped Rose onto a horse and led her away into the storm. The house felt empty after they left, like all the air had been sucked out of it. Jacob stood in the kitchen, staring at Rose's coffee cup still sitting on the table, lipstick marks on the rim proving she'd been real, not just a dream. Miguel Santos, Jacob's best ranch hand, knocked on the door an hour later. The older Mexican man had worked for Jacob for 5 years, and his weather-beaten face showed deep concern. "Patron," Miguel said quietly, "we saw the marshals. They took Miss Adelaide." Jacob nodded, not trusting his voice. "The men, they want to know, what happens to the garden? Miss Adelaide, she taught my Maria how to make the plants grow. My children, they love to help her work." Jacob looked out the window at the garden, where rain was washing over the neat rows Rose had created. Even in the storm, he could see the promise of what it might become: vegetables to feed his workers' families, flowers to bring beauty to this harsh land, fruit trees that would provide shade and food for years to come. "We keep working," Jacob said finally. "Rose, Miss Adelaide, she believed in what we were building here. We don't stop just because she's not here to see it finished." Miguel smiled for the first time since the marshals had arrived. "See, Patron, the men, they will help. We will make Miss Adelaide proud." That evening, Jacob sat alone at his kitchen table, writing letters by lamplight. One to the best lawyer he could afford in Cheyenne. Another to Sheriff Mackenzie, asking what evidence the marshals actually had. A third to his bank, arranging to withdraw money for Rose's defense. He didn't know much about the law, but he knew about people. And Rose Adelaide was not a murderer. Outside, the storm was finally passing, leaving the air clean and cool. Jacob walked out to the garden, where puddles reflected the first stars breaking through the clouds. The plants Rose had nurtured stood strong despite the harsh weather, their roots deep enough to weather any storm. Just like Rose herself, Jacob realized. Whatever had happened in Kansas, whatever secrets she carried, Rose Adelaide had deep roots now. She belonged here on this land, in this life they'd been building together one seed at a time. and Jacob Hartwell was going to make sure she came home. The Cheyenne courthouse buzzed with whispers and sideways glances as Jacob pushed through the crowd of curious onlookers. Word had spread fast about the murder trial. A woman accused of killing her husband was the kind of scandal that drew people from miles around like moths to a flame. Jacob had been riding back and forth between his ranch and the territorial capital for 2 weeks now, watching Rose sit pale and straight-backed in the defendant's chair while lawyers argued about her fate. Today was different, though. Today, witnesses would finally tell their stories. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Morrison," the bailiff called out. Judge Morrison was a thin man with steel-gray hair and spectacles that made his eyes look twice as large as they should be. He'd been fair so far, Jacob thought, but fair didn't always mean merciful. And mercy was what Rose needed most right now. "The prosecution may call its first witness," Judge Morrison announced. District Attorney Franklin Wells stood up, his black coat perfectly pressed and his mustache waxed to sharp points. He looked like the kind of man who enjoyed watching other people suffer, Jacob decided. "The prosecution calls Mrs. Edith Whitman to the stand." An elderly woman in a dark dress hobbled forward, leaning heavily on a walking stick. Her face was pinched with disapproval, and her small eyes darted toward Rose with obvious distaste. "Mrs. Whitman," Wells began, "you lived next door to William and Rose Adelaide in Topeka, Kansas, is that correct?" "For 3 years," Mrs. Whitman replied in a voice like rusty nails. "And I saw plenty in that time, let me tell you. What did you observe about the Adelaide marriage?" Mrs. Whitman's lips pressed together in a thin line. "Fighting. Constant fighting. That woman had a temper like a wildcat. Poor William would come home from work, and she'd start in on him before he even got through the door." Jacob felt his hands clench into fists. That didn't sound like the Rose he knew at all. Rose, who spoke gently to plants and never raised her voice even when his cattle broke through the fence and trampled her vegetable beds. "Did you witness the events of March 15th, the night William Adelaide died?" Wells continued. "I surely did," Mrs. Whitman said, settling back in her chair like she was preparing to tell a favorite story. "Around 10 o'clock, I heard shouting from their house. Terrible shouting, with her voice rising above his like a banshee." "What did you hear specifically?" "I heard her yelling about money, about how he was ruining them both. And I heard," Mrs. Whitman paused dramatically, "I heard her say she wished he was dead." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Jacob saw Rose's shoulders stiffen, but she kept staring straight ahead, her face showing nothing. Wells smiled like a cat who'd caught a particularly fat mouse. "And what happened next?" "The shouting stopped sudden-like. Then I saw a light moving around in their kitchen, and about an hour later, I saw that woman loading bags into a wagon by moonlight. Come morning, she was gone and poor William was dead on his kitchen floor." "Thank you, Mrs. Whitman. No further questions." Rose's lawyer, Benjamin Pierce, stood up slowly. Pierce was young and nervous, the only attorney Jacob could afford on short notice. But his eyes were sharp, and Jacob hoped that would be enough. "Mrs. Whitman," Pierce began, "you testified that you heard Mrs. Adelaide say she wished her husband was dead, but you didn't actually see what happened inside the house that night, did you?" "Well, no, but..." "So you don't know if Mrs. Adelaide struck her husband, or pushed him, or harmed him in any way?" Mrs. Whitman shifted uncomfortably. "I know what I heard. You heard arguing. But Mrs. Whitman, in 3 years of living next door, did you ever see William Adelaide strike his wife?" District Attorney Wells jumped up. "Objection. That's not relevant to the case. Goes to the character of the deceased, Your Honor," Pierce replied. Judge Morrison adjusted his spectacles. "I'll allow it. Answer the question, Mrs. Whitman." The elderly woman's face flushed red. Well, sometimes William had a drink or two after work. Men get frustrated, you know. It's natural. That's not what I asked. Did you ever see William Adelaide hit his wife?" Mrs. Whitman looked down at her hands. "Maybe once or twice, but she probably deserved it, the way she carried on." Several women in the courtroom gasped. Jacob saw Rose close her eyes briefly, and he understood. Mrs. Whitman had seen the abuse but had chosen to blame Rose for it instead of helping her. Pierce pressed on. Mrs. Whitman, you also testified that you saw Mrs. Adelaide loading bags into a wagon. Did she seem panicked? Frightened? She seemed like someone running away from what she'd done, Mrs. Whitman replied stubbornly. Or someone running away from more abuse, Pierce countered. No further questions. The next witness was Dr. Charles Franklin, the man who'd examined William Adelaide's body. Dr. Franklin was middle-aged and professional, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Dr. Franklin, Wells began, please describe the condition of William Adelaide's body when you examined it. The deceased appeared to have choked on his own vomit, Dr. Franklin replied clinically. He had a high level of alcohol in his system consistent with heavy drinking. There were no obvious signs of violence. No stab wounds, gunshot wounds, or blunt force trauma to the head. Jacob felt hope flicker in his chest. If William hadn't been murdered, then Rose couldn't be guilty of murder. But Wells wasn't finished. Doctor, in your professional opinion, could someone have caused William Adelaide to choke by, say, holding his head in a certain position? Dr. Franklin hesitated. It's possible, I suppose, if someone positioned an intoxicated person face down and prevented them from turning their head, asphyxiation could occur. The hope in Jacob's chest died. Wells was building a case that Rose had killed her husband without leaving obvious marks. Pierce stood for cross-examination. Dr. Franklin, you also noted other injuries on the deceased, didn't you? Yes. William Adelaide had bruised knuckles on both hands, consistent with striking someone or something. And did you examine Mrs. Adelaide? I did, the morning after her husband's death, before she left town. What did you find? Dr. Franklin's voice softened. She had a black eye, a split lip, and bruising on her arms and ribs consistent with being struck repeatedly. In your medical opinion, were these injuries fresh? Yes, inflicted within hours of my examination. Pierce nodded. So William Adelaide had beaten his wife severely the night he died? That would be consistent with the evidence, Dr. Franklin agreed. And Mrs. Adelaide was injured badly enough to require medical attention? She should have stayed in bed for several days to recover properly. But instead, she packed her belongings and left town? Yes. Pierce looked toward the jury. Dr. Franklin, in your experience, why might a woman leave town immediately after being severely beaten by her husband? Wells objected, but Judge Morrison allowed the question. Dr. Franklin looked directly at Rose, his eyes full of compassion. Because she was afraid he would hurt her again. Or worse. The courtroom fell silent. Jacob saw several women in the gallery nodding their heads in understanding. They knew what it was like to live in fear, to feel trapped with no way out. But the prosecution wasn't finished. Wells called 2 more witnesses, men who'd played cards with William Adelaide and testified that Rose had threatened her husband in public. Each story painted her as an angry, violent woman who'd finally snapped. Jacob listened to the lies and half-truths, watching Rose sit perfectly still as her character was torn apart by people who'd never bothered to know the real her. He wanted to stand up and shout the truth, that Rose Adelaide was gentle and kind, that she nurtured life instead of destroying it, that she'd brought light and hope to his dark world. But this was a courtroom, not a garden. Here, the truth grew slowly, one careful question at a time. And Jacob prayed that would be enough to save the woman he was beginning to realize he loved. Rose's voice cut through the stuffy courtroom air like a blade through silk as she raised her right hand to swear her oath. I do solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God. Jacob leaned forward in his seat, his heart hammering against his ribs. After 3 days of listening to other people tell their version of Rose's story, she was finally going to speak for herself. Her lawyer, Benjamin Pierce, had warned him that putting Rose on the stand was risky. Juries sometimes didn't trust women who defended themselves too strongly. But Rose had insisted. I won't let them paint me as a monster without fighting back, she told Pierce during their meeting yesterday. Whatever happens, I want the truth told. Now she sat in the witness chair, Her hands folded calmly in her lap despite the tremor Jacob could see in her fingers. She'd worn her simplest dress, gray as a mourning dove, and her hair was pulled back severely. She looked young and vulnerable, but her green eyes blazed with quiet determination. Pierce approached the witness box carefully. "Mrs. Adelaide, please tell the court about your marriage to William Adelaide." Rose's voice was steady but soft, forcing everyone in the courtroom to lean forward to hear her. "I married William when I was 19 years old. He was charming and handsome, and he promised we'd build a beautiful life together in Kansas. For the first year, I believed we would. What changed? William discovered that farming was harder work than he'd expected. The crops failed 2 years running, and he began drinking to forget his disappointment. When he drank, he became different." Pierce nodded encouragingly. "Different how?" Rose's hands tightened slightly in her lap. "Angry, violent. He blamed me for everything that went wrong, the weather, the crop failures, the debts that kept growing. And when words weren't enough to express his anger, he used his fists." A murmur ran through the courtroom. District Attorney Wells half rose from his chair, then sat back down, clearly deciding not to object. "Mrs. Adelaide, how often did your husband strike you?" "At first, maybe once a month. Always when he'd been drinking. He'd apologize the next morning, bring me flowers, promise it would never happen again." Rose's voice grew quieter. "But it did happen again, and again. By the end, it was happening almost every night." Jacob felt sick listening to her describe the hell she'd lived through. The Rose he knew was strong and confident, but he could see glimpses now of the frightened woman she'd been in Kansas. Pierce walked closer to the jury box. "Mrs. Adelaide, did you ever try to leave your husband?" "Once. About 6 months before he died. I packed a bag and went to stay with my cousin in Lawrence. But William found me within a week. He dragged me home and—" She paused, touching her throat unconsciously. "He made it clear that if I ever tried to leave again, he would kill me. And I believed him. So you stayed." "I stayed. I tried to be the perfect wife, to never give him reason to be angry. But there was always something. Dinner was too cold or too hot. The house wasn't clean enough. I'd smiled at the wrong person in town. There was always something." Pierce returned to his table and picked up a piece of paper. "Mrs. Adelaide, I'm going to read you some testimony from yesterday. Mrs. Whitman said she heard you tell your husband that you wished he was dead. Did you say those words?" Rose lifted her chin. "Yes, I did." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Jacob felt his heart sink. Why would she admit to that? "Why did you say them?" "Because in that moment, I did wish he was dead." Rose's voice grew stronger. "I wished I was free of him. I wished I could sleep through the night without wondering if he'd come home drunk and angry. I wished I could walk through my own house without flinching at every sound. Yes, I wished William was dead. But wishing something and doing something are very different things." Pierce nodded. "Tell the court what happened on the night of March 15th. Rose closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength. When she opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "William came home around 9 o'clock, drunker than I'd ever seen him. He'd been gambling again and he'd lost badly. When I asked him how much money he'd lost, he struck me so hard I fell to the floor. What happened next? He told me he'd gambled away the farm. Everything we owned. Everything my parents had left me when they died. It was all gone. When I started crying, he kicked me in the ribs and called me names I won't repeat in this courtroom." Jacob's hands clenched into fists. He wanted to punch something, preferably William Adelaide's ghost. "I got up and tried to reason with him," Rose continued. "I suggested we could start over somewhere else, that we could work together to build something new. That's when he grabbed me by the throat and started choking me." The courtroom was dead silent now. Even the babies had stopped crying. "I thought he was going to kill me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I grabbed the first thing my hand touched, a wooden spoon from the counter, and I hit him with it. Not hard, just enough to make him let go." "What did your husband do then?" "He laughed. He said I was pathetic, that I couldn't hurt him if I tried. Then he stumbled to the kitchen table and sat down heavily. He was so drunk he could barely hold his head up. Pierce walked back toward Rose. "What did you do?" "I went to our bedroom and started packing my clothes. I knew that when William sobered up, he'd be even angrier than before. I had to leave that night or he really would kill me." "How long were you in the bedroom?" "About an hour. When I came back to the kitchen with my bags, William was—" Rose's voice broke slightly. He was lying on the floor. His face was blue, and there was vomit everywhere. I could tell he wasn't breathing. "What did you do?" Rose looked directly at the jury, her eyes clear and honest. "I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, just staring at him. I thought about trying to help him, about turning him over and clearing his airway. But then I remembered what he'd done to me, what he'd threatened to do. And I realized that if I saved him, he would never forgive me for seeing him helpless. He would make me pay for it every day for the rest of my life." The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the tick of the wall clock. "So I left him there. I loaded my bags into our wagon and I drove away. I didn't call for help. I didn't try to save him. I let William Adelaide die, and I'm not sorry for it." District Attorney Wells jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, the defendant has just confessed to murder." "Objection," Pierce called out. "Mrs. Adelaide has confessed to no such thing. She has testified that she failed to render aid to a man who was already unconscious and dying from his own actions." Judge Morrison banged his gavel. "The jury will disregard Mr. Wells' comment. Continue, Mr. Pierce." But Pierce was done. "No further questions, Your Honor." Wells approached Rose like a wolf stalking a wounded deer. "Mrs. Adelaide, you've just admitted to this court that you stood by and watched your husband die. How is that not murder?" Rose met his gaze steadily. "Because I didn't kill him, Mr. Wells. William killed himself with whiskey and rage and cruelty. I just chose not to save him from the consequences of his own actions." "You chose to let him die." "I chose to live," Rose replied simply. "For the first time in 4 years, I chose my own life over his." Wells continued his attack for another hour, trying to trap Rose in contradictions or force her to admit to actual violence. But Rose remained calm and consistent. She had not struck the fatal blow. She had not poisoned her husband or pushed him or harmed him in any way. She had simply chosen not to save a man who had spent years trying to destroy her. When the cross-examination finally ended, Jacob felt drained, as if he'd been fighting the battle himself. Rose looked exhausted but unbowed as she stepped down from the witness chair. Tomorrow, the lawyers would make their closing arguments. Then the jury would decide whether Rose Adelaide was a murderer or a woman who had simply chosen to survive. Jacob prayed they would see what he saw, not a killer, but a survivor. Not a villain, but a woman who had finally found the courage to choose life over death, hope over despair, the truth over the lies that had trapped her for so long. The jury room door slammed shut with a sound like a coffin lid closing, leaving Rose and Jacob alone in the courthouse hallway while 12 strangers decided her fate. Rose sat on a hard wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the floor like she could see through it to some other world where none of this was happening. "How long do you think they'll take?" she asked quietly. Jacob sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Pierce says it could be anywhere from an hour to 3 days. Depends on how much arguing they do. And if they can't agree, then you go free." "But Rose," Jacob turned to face her fully. "What you said in there about letting William die, do you really feel no guilt about it?" Rose was quiet for so long that Jacob thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I feel guilt about a lot of things, Jacob. I feel guilty that I married him in the first place, that I stayed so long, that I believed his promises when I should have known better. But do I feel guilty about choosing my own life over his? No, I don't." She looked up at him then, her green eyes clear and unashamed. "Does that make me a terrible person?" Jacob wanted to take her hands, to pull her close and tell her she was the strongest, bravest person he'd ever known. Instead, he just shook his head. "It makes you human, Rose. It makes you someone who finally learned her own worth." Before Rose could respond, The courthouse doors burst open and Sheriff Mackenzie strode in, his face grim with bad news. Behind him came a man Jacob didn't recognize. Tall and thin with the pale skin of someone who spent his days indoors. "Jacob, Miss Adelaide," Mackenzie said, touching his hat brim. "This is Ezra Blackwood, William Adelaide's business partner from Kansas. He's got some information that might interest you." Blackwood stepped forward, his dark eyes fixed on Rose with an intensity that made Jacob's skin crawl. "Mrs. Adelaide, I've been following your trial with great interest." "Mr. Blackwood," Rose replied carefully, "I remember you. You and William had several business ventures together." Blackwood smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Indeed we did. Quite profitable ventures, until William's gambling problem got out of hand. Tell me, Mrs. Adelaide, did you know your husband owed me over $3,000 when he died?" Jacob felt Rose stiffen beside him. $3,000 was a fortune, more than most people saw in 5 years of hard work. "I knew William had debts," Rose said slowly, "but he never told me the exact amounts." "Of course not. William always was secretive about money matters." Blackwood reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. "This is a contract, signed by your husband 3 days before his death. It makes you responsible for all his outstanding debts." Rose went pale. "That's impossible. I never signed anything." "You didn't need to. As his wife, you inherited his obligations along with his assets. And since the farm was sold to pay other creditors, you'll need to find another way to settle his debt to me." Jacob stood up slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "What are you saying, Blackwood?" "I'm saying that if Mrs. Adelaide is acquitted of murder charges, she'll be free to come work for me until the debt is paid. I own several businesses in Kansas that could use a woman of her particular skills." The threat was clear as mountain water. Blackwood wasn't talking about honest work, and everyone in the hallway knew it. "Over my dead body," Jacob said quietly. Blackwood's smile widened. "That can be arranged, Mr. Hartwell. I have friends who specialize in solving problems like you." Rose stood up, placing herself between Jacob and Blackwood. "Stop, both of you." She looked at Blackwood with disgust. "You're no better than William was. Maybe worse, because at least he was honest about being a brute." "Careful, Mrs. Adelaide. You're in no position to make enemies." "I'm in no position to make friends either," Rose shot back. "So I might as well tell the truth. You and William weren't just business partners. You were partners in crime. The gambling, the cons, the money you stole from honest people. I know about all of it." Blackwood's face went hard as stone. "Prove it." "I don't have to prove it to you. But I might have to prove it to a federal judge if you keep threatening me and my friends." Sheriff Mackenzie stepped between them, his hand resting on his gun. "Gentlemen, lady, I think this conversation is over. Mr. Blackwood, you've delivered your message. Time to go." Blackwood straightened his coat and put his hat back on. "This isn't finished, Mrs. Adelaide. One way or another, debts get paid in this world." He walked away, his footsteps echoing off the courthouse walls like a death march. Mackenzie watched him go, then turned back to Jacob and Rose. "You two need to be very careful," he said quietly. "Men like Blackwood don't make idle threats. If Rose is acquitted, she needs to disappear fast." "She's not disappearing," Jacob said firmly. "She's coming home with me." "Jacob, no." Rose touched his arm. "I won't bring that kind of danger to your ranch. Too many innocent people could get hurt." "Rose, listen to me." Jacob turned to face her fully, his voice intense. "I don't care about Blackwood or his threats. I don't care about what people in town might say. I care about you. These past weeks, watching you fight for your life, seeing your courage in that courtroom, I've realized something I should have admitted weeks ago." Rose's eyes widened. "Jacob, don't." "I love you," he said simply. "I love your strength, your gentleness, your stubborn determination to make beautiful things grow in impossible places. I love the way you sing to the plants and the way you make me believe in second chances. I love you, Rose Adelaide, and I'm not letting you walk out of my life without a fight." Rose stared at him, tears streaming down her face. "Jacob, you don't understand. I'm not the woman you think I am. I'm damaged goods, a woman who let her husband die. You're the woman who saved herself when no one else would," Jacob interrupted. "You're the woman who took a dead garden and brought it back to life. You're the woman who taught me that it's never too late to start over, to plant new seeds and hope for a better harvest." Before Rose could respond, the jury room door opened. The bailiff stepped out, his face giving nothing away. "The jury has reached a verdict," he announced. "Court will reconvene in 10 minutes. Jacob took Rose's hand, feeling how cold her fingers were despite the warm day. "Whatever happens in there, Rose, you're not alone. We'll face this together." Rose squeezed his hand tightly. "Together," she whispered. As they walked back into the courtroom, Jacob caught sight of Blackwood sitting in the back row, watching them with the patience of a vulture waiting for something to die. But Jacob didn't care about vultures anymore. He cared about the woman beside him, the woman who had taught him that love was worth fighting for, no matter what the odds. The jury filed in, their faces serious and determined. Judge Morrison took his seat, and the bailiff called for order. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The foreman, a weathered rancher named Tom Willis, stood up with a piece of paper in his hand. "We have, Your Honor." Rose held her breath. Jacob felt his heart stop. In the case of the Territory of Wyoming versus Rose Adelaide, on the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant. The pause seemed to last forever. "Not guilty." The courtroom erupted in shouts and applause. Rose collapsed against Jacob's shoulder, sobbing with relief. But even as he held her, Jacob's eyes found Blackwood in the back of the room. The man was smiling, and Jacob knew their troubles were just beginning. Gunfire cracked through the crisp Wyoming morning like lightning splitting the sky, sending Jacob's cattle scattering across the pasture in wild-eyed panic. Rose dropped her watering can and ran toward the sound, her heart hammering against her ribs as she saw Jacob dive behind the water trough near the barn. "Stay down," he shouted, pulling his rifle from the scabbard on his saddle. Blackwood's men are in the rocks above the creek. 3 weeks had passed since the trial ended. 3 weeks of watching the horizon and sleeping with loaded guns beside their beds. Rose had hoped Blackwood might give up and return to Kansas, but she should have known better. Men like him never forgot a debt, especially when the debt came wrapped in wounded pride. Another shot rang out, this one splintering the wooden fence post just inches from Rose's head. She dropped to her knees and crawled toward the house, staying low as bullets whistled overhead like angry wasps. "Miguel!" Jacob called to his foreman, who was pinned down behind the hay wagon. "Take your boys and circle around through the gulch. Try to get behind them." "Sí, Patron," Miguel shouted back, then disappeared into the tall grass with 2 other ranch hands. Rose reached the house and grabbed Jacob's spare rifle from behind the door. She'd learned to shoot during her dark years with William. He'd insisted she know how to protect the farm when he was away gambling. Now she was grateful for that bitter lesson. "Rose, what are you doing?" Jacob yelled as she took position at the front window. "What needs doing?" she called back, checking the rifle's load. Through the glass, she could see muzzle flashes from the rocks about 200 yards away. 3 men, maybe 4, using the high ground to pin them down while they decided what to do next. But Rose had grown up in Kansas, where prairie storms could kill you if you waited too long to act. Sometimes the best defense was a good offense, even when you were outnumbered. She aimed carefully at the largest rock formation and squeezed the trigger. Her shot rang out clear and true, followed by a yelp of pain and surprise. At least she'd gotten someone's attention. "That's my girl," Jacob shouted, grinning despite the danger. "Keep them busy while Miguel flanks them." For the next 10 minutes, the ranch turned into a battlefield. Bullets flew back and forth like deadly hailstones, chipping bark from trees and raising dust clouds where they hit the ground. Rose reloaded and fired, working with the steady rhythm of someone who'd found her purpose. Then she heard it, a sound that made her blood turn to ice water. Horses' hooves, coming fast from the opposite direction. Blackwood had been smarter than they'd given him credit for. The men in the rocks were just a distraction. The real attack was coming from behind. "Jacob!" she screamed, pointing toward the road. More riders. 6 men on horseback burst over the hill, riding hard toward the ranch buildings. At their head rode Ezra Blackwood himself, his black coat flapping behind him like the wings of some evil bird. In his hand was a pistol that gleamed silver in the morning sun. Jacob spun around, his rifle swinging toward the new threat. But 6 against 1 was impossible odds, even for a man as tough as Jacob Hartwell. Rose saw immediately what would happen. Jacob would make his stand and die trying to protect her, and then Blackwood would take her anyway, unless she changed the game entirely. Rose stepped out onto the front porch, her rifle held high above her head in surrender. "Blackwood, I'm the one you want. Leave Jacob and his men alone." The riders pulled up in a cloud of dust, their guns trained on every door and window of the ranch house. Blackwood dismounted slowly, his dark eyes fixed on Rose with the satisfaction of a cat that had finally cornered its mouse. "Mrs. Adelaide," he said, his voice smooth as snake oil. "How good of you to be reasonable. I was beginning to think we'd have to do this the hard way." "Let them go," Rose said firmly. "Your business is with me, not with innocent people." Jacob appeared at the corner of the house, his rifle aimed squarely at Blackwood's chest. "Like hell. Rose, get back inside." Now, Mr. Hartwell," Blackwood said, not seeming worried about the gun pointed at him. "There's no need for more bloodshed. Mrs. Adelaide has a debt to pay, and I'm here to collect it. Once that's settled, we'll be on our way." "What kind of debt requires 6 armed men?" Jacob demanded. Blackwood smiled, but his eyes stayed cold as Winter Creek water. "The kind that involves $3,000 and 4 years of interest. Mrs. Adelaide owes me, and I intend to collect every penny." "I don't owe you anything," Rose said. "That debt died with William. Legally, perhaps, but there are other kinds of law in this world, Mrs. Adelaide. Older laws. The kind that say a man's debts follow his family until they're paid in full." One of Blackwood's men, a scarred brute with dead eyes, leaned forward in his saddle. "Boss, we gonna talk all day? The longer we stay here, the more chance someone else shows up." Blackwood nodded. "You're right, Cole. Mrs. Adelaide, you have a choice. Come with us willingly, and your friends live. Refuse, and we'll take you anyway, but we'll leave bodies behind." Rose felt the weight of the decision crushing down on her like a mountain. If she went with Blackwood, she'd spend the rest of her life as little more than a slave, working off a debt that would never truly be paid. But if she refused, Jacob and his men would die trying to protect her. It wasn't really a choice at all. "I'll come," she said quietly, "but I want your word that no one here gets hurt." "Rose, no." Jacob stepped forward, his finger tight on the trigger. "I won't let you." The shot came from the rocks above, where the original ambush had been set. But this time it wasn't aimed at the ranch. Cole, the scarred gunman, toppled from his horse with a surprised grunt, clutching his shoulder. Miguel and his men had completed their circle and were now shooting down at Blackwood's riders from above. Suddenly, the odds had changed dramatically. "Scatter!" Blackwood shouted, diving behind his horse as bullets rained down from the high ground. "Fall back to the creek." What followed was the wildest 5 minutes of Rose's life. Gunfire echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, horses screamed and reared, and men shouted orders that nobody could hear over the noise. Jacob grabbed Rose and pulled her behind the thick log walls of the house, while Miguel's men kept up a steady fire from their rocky perch. When the smoke finally cleared, 3 of Blackwood's men were wounded and all of them were in full retreat. Blackwood himself paused at the edge of rifle range, his hat gone and his perfect black coat torn and dusty. "This isn't over, Mrs. Adelaide," he shouted across the distance. "I'll be back. You can't hide behind other people's guns forever." Then he was gone, disappearing over the hill with his remaining men like shadows fleeing the dawn. Jacob pulled Rose close, his arms trembling with relief and leftover fear. "Are you hurt? Did they hit you?" "I'm fine," Rose whispered, but she wasn't fine at all. Her hands were shaking, Her knees felt weak, and her mind was spinning with the terrible knowledge that this was far from over. Miguel came running from the rocks, his weathered face split by a huge grin. "We got them, Patron. Sent them running like rabbits." "For now," Jacob replied grimly. "But Blackwood's not the type to give up easy. He'll be back with more men and a better plan." Rose pulled away from Jacob's embrace, her green eyes hard with determination. "Then we need to be ready for him. This is my fight, Jacob. I won't let him hurt anyone else because of me." "It's not just your fight anymore," Jacob said firmly. "Blackwood threatened my ranch, my people. That makes it personal." Miguel nodded agreement. "The men, they will fight, Senora. You are one of us now. We protect our own." Rose looked around at the faces surrounding her. Jacob strong and determined, Miguel's loyal and fierce, the other ranch hands nodding their agreement. For the first time since William's death, she felt like she truly belonged somewhere. But belonging came with a price, and Rose was beginning to understand that some debts could only be paid with blood. The scent of apple blossoms drifted across the Broken Arrow Ranch on a warm May morning, carried by gentle breezes that made the new leaves dance on Catherine's old fruit trees. Rose knelt in the garden, her hands deep in rich, dark soil as she transplanted seedlings that would grow into food for the coming winter. 6 months had passed since Blackwood's attack, 6 months of watching the horizon and sleeping with guns nearby. But gradually, as spring turned the harsh Wyoming landscape green and welcoming, life had returned to something like normal. The garden flourished under Rose's careful attention. The cattle grew fat on new grass, and Jacob's smile came easier with each passing day. "The roses are blooming," Jacob said, walking up behind her with 2 cups of coffee steaming in the morning air. Rose looked toward the corner of the garden where Catherine's climbing roses had been reborn from what everyone had thought were dead roots. Clusters of pink and white flowers covered the new trellis Jacob had built, their fragrance mixing with the smell of fresh earth and growing things. "Catherine would be proud," Rose said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "She chose well when she planted these. They're survivors, just like everything else worthwhile in this hard country." Jacob settled beside her on the wooden bench he'd placed under the apple tree. "Like you." Rose smiled, but her eyes stayed serious. "Jacob, we need to talk about what happens next." "What do you mean?" Rose set down her coffee and turned to face him fully. "I mean Blackwood has been too quiet, too peaceful. Men like him don't just give up and go away. They plan, they wait, and then they strike when you least expect it." Jacob's jaw tightened. "Maybe. But Rose, we can't live our whole lives looking over our shoulders. At some point, we have to trust that we've built something stronger than whatever he can throw at us." "Have we?" Rose asked quietly. "Built something strong enough, I mean." Before Jacob could answer, the sound of a single horse approaching made them both look toward the road. A rider was coming at an easy pace, not the desperate gallop that usually meant trouble. As the figure got closer, Rose recognized Sheriff Mackenzie, but something was different about him. He looked relaxed. "Morning, folks," Mackenzie called out as he dismounted. "Beautiful day for working in the garden." "Duncan," Jacob nodded. "What brings you out our way?" Mackenzie pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket, his weathered face creasing into an unusual smile. "Good news for once. Got a telegram from the federal marshal in Kansas. Thought you'd want to hear it right away." Rose felt her heart start beating faster. News from Kansas could only mean one thing: Blackwood. "Ezra Blackwood was arrested 3 days ago in Topeka," Mackenzie continued. "Turns out the federal government has been investigating him for mail fraud, counterfeiting, and running confidence games across state lines. They had enough evidence to put him away for 20 years, but they needed someone to testify about his activities." "Someone testified?" Rose asked. Mackenzie's smile widened. "Several someones. Seems Blackwood made a lot of enemies over the years. When word got out that the feds were finally taking him seriously, people started coming forward with stories, including a few folks who knew about his partnership with your late husband." Rose felt like a huge weight was lifting off her shoulders. "So he's really gone? He can't come after us anymore. He's going to be a guest of the federal government for a very long time, Mackenzie confirmed. And even if he somehow got out early, his criminal organization is finished. Most of his men have been arrested or scattered to the winds. You're free, Rose. Really free this time. Jacob stood up and shook Mackenzie's hand vigorously. Duncan, I can't thank you enough for bringing us this news. Just doing my job, Mackenzie replied. Though I have to say, it's nice to be the bearer of good news for a change. He remounted his horse and tipped his hat. You folks enjoy your day. You've earned some peace. As Mackenzie rode away, Rose sat in stunned silence. Free. After years of living in fear, first of William, then of Blackwood, she was finally, truly free. No more looking over her shoulder. No more wondering when the next threat would appear. She could plant her garden and watch it grow without fear that she'd be torn away before harvest time. Rose. Jacob's voice was gentle. How do you feel? Rose looked around at the garden she'd brought back to life, at the ranch buildings that had become home, at the man who'd stood by her through every trial and danger. I feel rooted, she said finally. Like I finally belong somewhere. Jacob knelt down beside her, taking her dirt-stained hands in his own. Rose Adelaide, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about building something strong enough to last. And I realized you're right, we need to make this official. Rose's heart started beating faster again. But this time it was hope, not fear, that made her pulse race. I know I'm not much to look at, Jacob continued, his voice rough with emotion. I'm a simple rancher with calloused hands and more determination than sense. But I love you, Rose. I love your strength and your gentleness and the way you make beautiful things grow in impossible places. I love how you've taught me that it's never too late for second chances. He pulled a small object from his pocket, a ring he'd carved from a piece of apple wood. Simple but beautiful, with tiny flowers etched around the band. Rose Adelaide, will you marry me? Will you let me be your husband, your partner, your friend for whatever time we have left in this world? Rose looked at the ring, at Jacob's hopeful face, at the garden blooming around them like a promise of better days to come. A year ago, she'd been trapped in a nightmare marriage with a man who'd tried to destroy her spirit. Now she was being offered a chance at real love with a man who saw her true worth. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, Jacob Hartwell, I'll marry you. Jacob slipped the wooden ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, like it had been made just for her. Which Rose realized it had been. Everything about this moment, this place, this man, felt like it had been crafted especially for her by hands that understood what she needed most. As Jacob kissed her under the blooming apple tree, Rose heard the sound of approaching hooves again. This time it was Miguel and several of the ranch hands, their faces bright with curiosity and hope. Patron, Miguel called out. We heard shouting. Is everything all right? Jacob stood up, keeping his arm around Rose's waist. Everything's perfect, Miguel. Mrs. Adelaide has agreed to become Mrs. Hartwell. The ranch hands let out whoops of joy and congratulations. Miguel grinned so wide his weathered face looked like it might split in two. A wedding. Maria. She will be so happy. She has been hoping for this since the day Miss Adelaide arrived. As the celebration continued around them, Rose looked down at the simple wooden ring on her finger. It wasn't gold or silver, wasn't decorated with precious stones. But it was real, and it was hers, and it represented something she'd never thought she'd have. A love based on mutual respect, shared dreams, and the courage to build something beautiful together. When? She asked Jacob quietly. When what? When do you want to get married? Jacob looked around at the garden in full bloom, at the ranch hands still celebrating, at the endless Wyoming sky stretching blue and cloudless overhead. How about Sunday? Give folks time to spread the word, get cleaned up, maybe convince the circuit preacher to stick around an extra day. Rose laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. Sunday sounds perfect. That gives me time to finish transplanting the tomatoes. Only you would worry about garden work while planning your wedding, Jacob said, but his tone was full of love and admiration. Someone has to think practically, Rose replied. Besides, I want everything to be perfect for our first harvest as husband and wife. Jacob pulled her close again, and Rose felt the last of her old fears melt away like snow in spring sunshine. She was home. She was loved. She was free. And in the garden where death had once ruled, life was blooming again.